Hello, everyone. My name is Riel Massey, and I work with NAIT and the Centre for Boreal Research in Peace River. Uh, I am joined by two lovely speakers today who I will introduce in just a moment. But before that, there's a couple partners that I need to thank for the Boreal Nature Series. They are part of the Partners in Boreal Education program, and they make programs like this possible and have for a number of years now. And they are Canadian Forest Products Limited, Mercer Peace River Pulp, West Fraser Manning Timber Co., Boucher Brothers Lumber Limited, and Divisha Sawmills Limited. Finally, I also want to acknowledge that even though we're meeting online today, a lot of the research that we conduct around Alberta is taking place on treaty territory and Métis region territory. So that includes for us Treaty 6 and Treaty 8, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta regions 1, 5, and 6. And finally, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. So we're joined today by Michelle Knaggs, who is a PhD student at the University of Alberta. Her thesis uses tree rings and remote sensing to identify landscape characteristics that buffer tree growth responses and to drought and recovery from wildfire. Her master's research was focused on boreal songbird community responses to wildfire. And we're also joined today by Alex Lanty-Trykovsky, who is a master's student at the University of Alberta and a climate change technician with the Canadian Forest Service. His thesis work investigates topo-edaphic and climate factors that promote post-fire recovery in peatland-dominated landscapes. So without further ado, please help me welcome our lovely speakers. And whenever you two are ready, you can begin.
Great. Thanks so much for the lovely introduction. And thank you everyone for coming today. So our talk for today is titled Do Peatland-Dominated Landscapes Buffer Forests from Drought and Their Implications for Climate Change Refugia. I was already given a great introduction, so I won't go over it too much, but I'm Alex Lanty-Trykovsky. I'm a master's student and I also work here at Canadian Forest Service, supervised by Dr. Scott Nielsen at the U of A in the Applied Conservation Ecology Lab. Also by Dion Strahlberg here at CFS. I work with Michelle on this kind of refugia project that is kind of spearheaded by Scott and Deanna, kind of a big partnership between the U of A and CFS in the larger climate refugia project.
Yeah, and I'm Michelle, the PhD student.
Great. And before we proceed with our talk, I didn't know there would be a land acknowledgement for the seminar, but I would just like to proceed with our own land acknowledgement and just let everyone know that we also respectfully acknowledge that our research takes place on Treaty 6 and 8 territory. And these are the traditional territories of the Cree, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Métis people. And most of us, again, live and work on Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, and just acknowledging that we live on these lands that have been cared for generations by those people who came before us. So, I'll pass it to you, Michelle, to introduce Boreal Alberta's changing climate.
Sweet. Well, just first off, I just want to mention how Alex and I will talk about our individual studies, but since our questions are so closely related, and because we've helped each other, so much in the field collecting our data, I think it's really fun that we get to do this joint presentation. And we'll start it off by talking about climate change because that's what brought us here today. So, we know that Northern Alberta's boreal forest has historically been a pretty dry place, and mean annual precipitation hasn't actually changed that much over the last 100 years. But as we've seen a rise in temperature of 2 to 3 degrees, that's increased the amount of moisture that's lost to evaporation and evapotranspiration. And the result is that there's been a slight decrease in the amount of precipitation for plants. And these two maps show on the left the historical baseline moisture availability. And if we look in Alberta, you see there's typically just a little bit of excess moisture, not a ton. And then when we go forward, just within the century, we're expecting that the amount of moisture is going to shift so that there's going to be a little bit, there'll be a potentially moisture deficit overall. And this has the potential to impact trees, which is what Alex and I are studying, not just by limiting the moisture that's on the landscape, but as temperature increases and CO2 in the atmosphere increases, this increases the water requirements for trees, potentially further stressing them. And if we go and look, oops. And when we translate these changes in climate to where ecosystems will have to shift to in the foreseeable future, we come up with these really shocking maps. The first time I saw these two maps on the right, so the map on the left shows the current state of our ecosystems in Alberta, where the Boreal Plains, which is where Alex and I's work takes place, is the medium green. And then the two maps on the left show the ecosystems that will be suitable to our changing climate within the next 100 years. And of course, our ecosystems aren't going to shift overnight to new locations, but we can expect to see some potentially really dramatic changes over the next 100 years, or the next couple hundred years. And we've started to be able to detect this, on the ground. One, due to increasing severity, frequency, and extent of wildfire, which we're starting to see lead to, these potential situations where when a forest burns, it's not able to regenerate and it transitions to a different state, such as grassland or shrubland. And then more subtly, we are seeing decreasing water availability and the changes in when that precipitation arrives, resulting in reduced tree growth and in some cases tree mortality. And there's a bunch of studies over across the western boreal that have already documented this. So studies that have found growth declines in step with drought are examples would be black spruce in Alaska, jack pine in Saskatchewan and Ontario, especially when coupled with pest outbreaks, decreases in white spruce growth in Alberta, and then just like outright increased mortality of all the major boreal species actually across the whole boreal, as well as pronounced aspen die-offs, especially towards the lower end of the more southern end of the boreal with drought. And this is also being detected now using satellite imagery.
Yeah, so along with the increased mortality and drought stress of mature trees, these more frequent fires and drought disturbances are also leading to increased conifer regeneration failure across the boreal. This has also been shown on the ground, like with studies by Ellen Whitman, who's out of the CFS here, who showed that with shortening fire-free intervals and increasing moisture stress, we're seeing a reduction in regenerating conifer stems, and also a reduction in kind of resilience of a lot of conifer species like black spruce across Canada, and particularly in the Boreal Plains, which is what comprises most of Boreal Alberta. And we're seeing that black spruce is declining there, and that the alternate trajectory for those forests are increasingly, or is likely to be more dominated by jack pine and aspen. And and other remote sensing studies have also observed this change across the boreal forest, like the study by Wang et al. In 2019, and they showed basically a decrease in total, 15% decrease in total conifer cover across the western boreal, and with a pretty much complementary increase in deciduous forest gain, suggesting that these conifers are kind of being being replaced by more deciduous species, and this is likely due to climate change disturbances like increased wildfire and drought.
Okay, so we've seen all these changes to date, and then again when we look at predictions of where species will be suitable to the changing climate, we again come up with these really dramatic maps. So for example, the map on the left is white spruce, the one on the right is black spruce. The gray shows the historical or the current habitats of these like really dominant species. And then the color ramp shows where the climate will be suitable for these species, just within 100 years. So where our work comes in is that, particularly when we look at Alberta on these maps, we see that most of the boreal is not going to be suitable to these tree species. So what we want to get with these questions that we're asked with our questions is that, are there maybe aspects of the landscape where these trees will have a little bit of a better time at hanging on a little bit longer? And these have been called climate refugia. So climate refugia are just like any area on the landscape where, because of either intrinsic factors or temperature moderation or the ability to moderate water availability, we believe that the species in that area may be able to hang on a little bit longer. These refugia might not exist in perpetuity, but they may allow species a little bit of a safe zone to adapt or effectively move to a more suitable area over time. They can be large scale or small scale. And actually somebody in our lab, Cesar Estevo, he's worked on looking at the potential for temperature refugia in northern Alberta. So he's identified these large hill systems in northern Alberta as being a little bit cooler and potential temperature refugia for those more low-lying species to give them the potential to move up to a little bit of a better temperature. So yeah, just talking a little bit about climate refugia, how there's evidence for potential temperature refugia based on higher areas, things like north-facing slopes, north sides of mountains, potential buffering effects of large lakes and oceans. But what we're interested in is looking at the potential for peatlands to be able to more effectively hold on to water in the landscape as opposed to, say, even open water or upland habitat.
Yeah, and there's pretty good evidence for the drought buffering potential of peatlands, given that they basically act like these big sponges on the landscape that kind of retain water in dry periods and also supply water to upland forest during these dry periods. They've also been demonstrated in remote sensing studies to kind of lessen the impacts of drought on vegetation trajectories in peatland-dominated landscapes. And also with regards to like disturbance protection, like from fire. Yeah, there have been studies like the one by Lucan back in 2017, who found that there's higher burn severity at peatland margins and lower severity in the middles, and then kind of lower severity overall in peatlands with higher amount of groundwater connectivity. And so this is what Michelle and I are super interested in, is that these drought buffering effects haven't really been empirically studied yet in Alberta. So that's what we aim to get at. And yeah, although yeah, peatlands do this really good job of retaining water on the landscape, we kind of think that there will be differing buffering effects based on the differing groundwater regimes of a given peatland system. So we can get an idea of what these groundwater regimes are if we look at the hydrogeologic context of a given system. And these regimes are governed more or less by the underlying soil texture and landform topography. So for example, you get bog-like peatlands forming in kind of landscape depressions in fine textured soils where they're primarily fed by precipitation, and that fine textured soil keeps the water there for a long period of time to get the buildup of peat and so on. And then in lower lying areas, you get larger peatland wetland complexes forming that have a lot of interconnectivity between them, and kind of have groundwater regimes dominated more by that than by precipitation. And they tend to stay wet for long periods of time. And then if you look on kind of the other end of the soil spectrum in coarse textured soils, you can get these more fen-like systems that form where the regional groundwater intersects the surface and are recharged kind of by these sandy hummocks where precipitation can easily transmit down into the regional groundwater, and and supply that regional groundwater to those areas. So yeah, these kind of conceptual understandings of how groundwater moves kind of informs our kind of overarching hypothesis of how peatlands may buffer upland forests from drought. But all that to say is basically that, yeah, we think they'll buffer, but in different capacities, and we're going to approach that in different ways. With Michelle kind of testing the hypothesis that peatlands will buffer tree growth in response to drought, looking at tree rings using dendrochronology methods to test that. And then I'm going to test the hypothesis that peatlands buffer post-fire tree regeneration from post-fire drought.
Right, so Alex just mentioned, the main objective of this project is trying to determine if peatlands buffer adjacent upland trees from drought, and it does this vary with those different landscape characteristics. And I'm using the dendro tree ring approach to look at changes in tree growth. And this is my first foray into dendrochronology, and what's so amazing about it is that not only do we get to see how the trees are responding currently, but we get to peek back in time and see how these trees have been responding to climate their entire lives. And this is especially important when we're, talking about climate change and trying to detect, how trees are currently responding and understanding if they're already declining and experiencing the pressures of climate change, or if they don't care yet. There have been quite a lot of studies in the Boreal that have looked at different tree species and found that, from like the early 1900s to, the 40s to the 1980s, tree growth on the whole actually increased. And that could be because the weather was a little balmier, trees liked the little bit higher of a temperature, there was a little more CO2 in the air. Trees were partying and pretty happy. But then between the 40s and the 80s, potentially the water requirements needed to continue that those increases in growth, that the water availability wasn't there. And lots of studies have found these gradual decreases over time since then in growth. And this Pang et al. Study too, and from 2011, which looked at boreal trees from across Canada, found also this general increasing trend of mortality. So that's something interesting to look for in my data as well. So the overall study design was to collect tree cores from trees that were directly adjacent to a peatland. The idea being that their roots would be able to access water discharging from peatlands during periods of drought. So these trees wouldn't really care what was going on with the climate, they would have a steady supply of water. Whereas trees presumably detached from that potential water supply by a combination of distance and elevation would be a lot more sensitive to the amount of precipitation they get and more climatically sensitive. And then, like Alex mentioned, this general hypothesis will be complicated by different variables on a broader regional landscape, particularly that, these peatlands in low-lying areas have more access to groundwater and may be able to maintain their water supplies during drought, and therefore the adjacent trees will benefit. As increasing elevation, the trees will be more sensitive to drought. So I had a whole bunch of help to collect a whole bunch of tree cores between High Level in the northwest and Lac La Biche in the southeast. And so at each site we visited, we collected cores from either jack pine or white spruce. And at each site we had these little paired plots where we collected tree cores from trees directly adjacent to a peatland, and then trees that were presumably detached from that peatland water source. And one of the really fascinating parts about learning how dendrochronology works is that it's pretty complicated, and there's so many ways to tease out patterns from these tree rings. So the method that I'm using is just the tried and true annual growth rates, but there are other ways of teasing patterns of growth out of the wood. Another way we can use our samples is by using either the tree as a sampling unit or a group of nearby trees and creating an average signal from them all. And then what is generally important for most analysis is being able to account for the fact that there's an age growth relationship, whereas when the tree is young, its rings are going to be wider. And there's also many different ways to account for this. But for what I'll show you today, I'm sticking with converting the ring widths to the theoretical area that tree would have grown in a certain year, because it conceptually makes sense to me. And it is also possible to break down that signal further by longer term versus short term trends. And then, getting to figure out how we want to measure drought is also a little bit of an adventure, and it's really interesting how many different ways there are to assess climate. What's really commonly used and what Alex and I are both using is, taking precipitation and then incorporating temperature to approximate how much potential evaporation might be removing moisture from the landscape. So that creates the plot on the right there. So that's showing the climate moisture index, where values above 0 indicate there's a moisture surplus, values below 0 are a deficit, and this is the average for my study area. So you can see it can really vary from year to year. Then another neat part about figuring out how to measure drought is it can be measured over all different time periods, and we can also look at just like the general correlations of growth with climate during certain times of the year, or we can look at how that's possibly changed over time. So what I'm going to show today is just a first kick of the can descriptive results, but I think they're still really neat to look at. So this shows the basal area increment, so a method of looking at growth rates over time for my trees split up by spruce in the green and then a pine in the yellow, and then further split up by trees that were in those far plots versus near plots. And then with the CMI, the cumulative moisture index, below for reference. And like a couple things that pop out is that the pine does look like it generally shows that trend where growth rates were stable or increasing until the 70s or so, and there's been a bit of a consistent decrease since then. The growth rates don't seem to be super obviously tied with moisture deficits or droughts, but that could be expected because they're a drought tolerant species. But then when we look at spruce, there's a little bit more of an obvious pattern between the moisture index and these growth rates. And what's kind of interesting to look at initially, especially since the 70s, is that it does seem like those trees that are at the farther plots have the potential to have higher growth rates, but when there's drought, they decline to be in step with the trees in the near plots. But then the next step is to take the ring widths and the moisture indexes and correlate the two to see how in step they are. So I have a very big take homes from this so the x-axis are the different plots that we sampled. The y-axis shows the moisture index for certain months. The first lowercase July and August are the previous year's indexes, and then the capitalized ones are the moisture indexes for that current year. And the take home would be that the white spruce are significantly positively correlated with moisture, meaning that if there's more moisture, they're growing. If there's less moisture, they're not happy and they're not growing so well. Whereas jack pine is way more of a mixed bag and there's less overall significance. But I think where this will really get interesting is when we look at how these correlations have changed over time. And what really stands out is, so these are a little bit mixed up, but so this first plot right here is, the plot on the left is jack pine, and then on the right plot is white spruce. That label just got a little mixed up. And what this shows are correlations on the y-axis, where correlations above 0 indicate increasing climate sensitivity, and where there are little dots indicates like significance. So significant correlations with climate. And each of these lines indicates a plot that we sampled. And this isn't my whole data set, so the sample size will eventually be bigger. But what's really neat about the jack pine is we can see in the late 80s, early 90s, there's a big flip-de-doo where all of a sudden many of the sites become sensitive to climate. And then if we color the plots by their relative regional position, it looks like it's these sites at the higher elevations that are suddenly more sensitive to precipitation. There's neat patterns on the white spruce too, but nothing so obvious. And one thing I wanted to do was just see if we could explain the patterns in these correlations by the local landscape variables. So how far a plot was from peatland and the elevation from the peatland versus these regional factors. And for jack pine, it looks like the regional factors really play more of a role. For white spruce, both the local and regional factors have explain some of the variance of the patterns we see. But then if we go and just look at the last 16 years where there's this real neat pattern that emerges, I find that there's none of the local variables don't explain any of this variability, so it falls more on the regional variables. So again, I have a lot more work to do and a lot more analyses to do, and I'll be incorporating more environmental variables. But what it appears to be that our hypothesis that the increasing elevation in these regional landscapes do have an impact on water availability for these trees, but not necessarily evidence for the local landscape yet.
Sweet, Michelle. Yeah, those are pretty interesting preliminary results. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens when you have more of your course process. But yeah, it'll be cool to see how your findings, how some of them might overlap with mine. So now my project is looking at after fire and drought. And basically what I'm trying to get at is how big, and which trees are regenerating compared to quote unquote normal regeneration conditions, and what factors in these peatland-dominated landscapes are influencing regenerating forest structure and the tree species coming back after fire and drought. And kind of the idea is that if we can identify these factors, we can get an idea of under which hydrogeologic contexts are we likely to see altered post-fire kind of ecological trajectories with climate change. So yeah, like we've mentioned before, kind of looking at the same factors as Michelle, looking at different hydrologic regimes across the boreal plains. So first looking at the soil texture, the elevation, above the nearest peatland, or getting an idea of those local factors, and then those landscape factors. I'm trying to get a measure of where it is relative to like a low on the landscape to see if that has any effect. So my overall hypotheses, are basically the same as Michelle's. I'm thinking that, at higher landscape positions where you're going to have less peatlands, less groundwater connectivity, I'm basically thinking that you'll get less regeneration and more deciduous tree species coming back. So specifically what this means for my project and what I measured is that I expect to see lower densities in stem basal area at these higher landscape positions with drought, lower proportions of jack pine and black spruce in those sandier soils with more aspen. Although jack pine is quite drought tolerant, I'm kind of operating under the assumption that, there's the potential for the drought to be intense enough to cause jack pine regeneration failure and then have aspen come in instead. And then on fine textured soils, thinking, that I'll see more or lower proportions of black and white spruce, and again, more aspen. So to test these hypotheses, I sampled 58 sites in 2020 and 2021. Also, Michelle got a couple sites for me back in 2019, so thanks for that. And that was across 5 fires, aged 5 to 20 years across Alberta. If I can get this to go. That had a combination of wet and dry post-fire moisture conditions. So we can see the driest post-fire moisture conditions in the Richardson fire that happened in 2011 at the site there. Then the next driest in the Chisholm fire that happened back in 2001. And then, also the Fort Mac fire was also fairly dry. And then with the wettest being the post-fire moisture conditions being in the Uticuma fire in 2011 and the House River fire from 2002. And within these fires, I also sampled sites, across the fine and coarse textured soils. So at each site, I sampled vegetation in plots spanning a peatland to upland gradient, where I measured, just the density, basal area, and species proportions of, the overstory trees, saplings, and seedlings, and collected mineral soil samples as well, so that I can get a measure of soil texture. Also I took an approach to getting a measure of landscape position, and I did this by basically taking the elevation of a given plot relative to like a low or a known groundwater discharge point within a defined neighborhood. So you'll notice that these neighborhoods are different sizes, and this is just based on where they are and our kind of knowledge of the landscape. So for instance, in the northwest here, just north of Slave Lake, these sites actually follow a hydrogeologic transect in the Uticuma region study area, which is a long-term hydrologic transect headed by Kevin DeVito at the U of A. So we tried to use that to use those like known recharge and discharge points to capture those in our neighborhoods. And then looking down further south at the sites in the Chisholm fire, I just used the Athabasca River kind of as a landscape low there from which to get a reference. Moving further north, I used a kind of a larger neighborhood in this this area just north of Lac La Biche and between Conklin, trying to capture the kind of the intermediate landscape position between this low-lying area here and kind of the Stony Mountain hill system there. And then up in Fort Mac and Fort Mackay, again, just using the Athabasca River and Clearwater rivers as landscape lows to get a measure of that. I also got a measure of drought using Climate NA to get a measure of cumulative climatic moisture deficit. That's just the index that I chose. Like Michelle said, we can use a number of indices. This CMD is frequently used in a lot of regeneration studies as a climate variable. So I chose that, and I used that in the years, basically the first 4 years after each fire. I took that as being the most biologically meaningful measure to get the climate in those kind of crucial regeneration years after a fire. And then so I took all these variables and I analyzed them in statistical models representing kind of my hypotheses and then potential alternative outcomes. I used my analyzed them in like a terrain interactive with drought model, which is kind of what I hypothesized, where this landscape elevation or local elevation would interact with drought and soil texture to influence vegetation. Then I also just looked at a simple terrain model where there is no drought, a model with terrain and drought, but they are acting independently of each other, a simple drought model, and then just like a time since fire model where we basically just assume that all the variation we're seeing is just because of the different ages of the fires, and then like a null model, basically just saying there's nothing going on. And through model selection, what I found is that black spruce proportions fit best in my hypothesized models, whereas stem density, basal area, jack pine and aspen proportion were better explained by the terrain models. And unfortunately, white spruce, my proportions of white spruce were best explained by the null model, which basically means that nothing is going on there. So looking at the results of these final models, what these figures essentially are saying are that anything to the left of the dashed line is a negative effect on any of these response variables up here, and anything to the right of that dashed line is a positive effect. And basically what we're seeing here with post-fire forest structure is that there isn't really much, there is no effect at all of drought on the regenerating stem densities and basal area. And basically, yeah, in these, we're just seeing that there's a reduction in density in older fires on clay soils, and also there are just less dense forests in higher landscape elevations on sandy soils, and then just lower stem basal area in older soil or in older forests on clay soils. So not much going on there, just kind of intrinsic processes. But when we look at post-fire forest composition, the interesting result here is that we're seeing a significant effect of drought on black spruce proportions at higher landscape elevations, and that we're also seeing this effect kind of be, a bigger effect when we parse that out between coarse and fine textured soils. So we're seeing an even greater effect, negative effect on black spruce proportions in clay soils at high landscape elevations that have experienced drought, and then and then slightly less negative effect on sandy soils on black spruce proportions. So that's what the results of those models mean. To summarize these results, basically what I found was that post-fire drought did not affect regenerating forest structure. Early successional species like jack pine and aspen were not affected by post-fire drought. Black spruce regeneration was reduced by post-fire drought, and at high landscape elevations, it was significantly reduced across soil textures, and that I couldn't detect any patterns for regenerating white spruce. So I haven't dug too deep into why I found these results. I'm still in that stage of my thesis work, but I do have some speculations as to why we're seeing what we're seeing come out of these models. And one of my kind of conclusions are that boreal tree species are quite generalistic. They're already adapted to fire and the dry landscape, especially aspen and jack pine, and that maybe the drought conditions that I captured post-fire just kind of lack the intensity to reduce generation in these species and prohibit us from finding that signal. Black spruce is adapted to wetter environments and is less adapted to intense fires. So that could be why we saw significant reductions with drought, and it's currently declining in western boreal forests, as we talked about earlier, due to more frequent drought and wildfire. And then when it comes to white spruce, don't really know what to say just yet. I need to look into that more, but I don't know, it could be that I just had too low of a sample size. Given that it is a late successional species, maybe I just didn't have enough time post-fire to see a lot of white spruce regeneration, or maybe just a lack of pre-fire white spruce sites. I'd have to look into my data a little more, but I could have just basically just not sampled a whole lot of sites that were those older growth white spruce sites, or those super wet white spruce sites. So to kind of bring all these findings together and how they relate to refugia, I think we can say that an overlapping theme here is that regional factors seem more important to consider than local factors when we're talking about identifying refugia in Alberta's boreal forest, and that predominant tree species do regenerate following post-fire drought, but black spruce is definitely more vulnerable to post-fire drought at higher landscape positions, and that mature white spruce and jack pine growth may be more sensitive to drought at higher landscape elevations, but we'll see. We'll see what happens there when the rest of Michelle's data comes in.
Yeah, so beyond just the identification of refugia, part of the reason I wanted to come back to school is to better understand, how do we use this information that we have, but plus be able to incorporate all these like massive changes and complicated changes that our environment will be experiencing, and how do we manage for that? And there's some pretty neat, simple decision frameworks that have come about more recently, the resist, accept, direct framework, which is just designed to help people decide where, where maybe an area or species will be able to resist climate change unassisted, so that refugia would be a good example of an area like that, versus areas where maybe the ecosystem is going to be toast and eventually just change to something completely different. There's nothing we can do about it. We need to let that happen. Versus areas where, with climate change, maybe an ecosystem is going to shift, but with a little bit of, human intervention and direction, maybe we can make sure it stays as something that's functional and represents its original state. And the refugia also, fall into this call to just to protect as much of our natural environment as possible, giving species the genetic diversity and the time and the space to be able to adapt and move with climate change. So, yeah, although I don't have finished results yet, and Alex is just finalizing his our general workflow that we hope, where our little puzzle pieces that we figured out can be fed into the identification of potential climate refugia in northern Alberta, and perhaps using some sort of framework like the RAD framework. Land managers, forest managers can prioritize areas for conserving and saving from other human impacts. So, for example, maybe our conclusions are that uplands that are adjacent to peatlands in these low-lying areas really have this potential to stick around longer than anywhere else. So we need to prioritize, creating buffers around these peatlands and protecting these forests. Yeah, and that's what we have for a presentation. We wanted to acknowledge that we've had a lot of help along the way, and thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you so much, you two. That was excellent, super informative. We do have 15 minutes left in our scheduled time, so we can take this opportunity to answer any questions from the audience if there are any. I'll just ask that you use the raise your hand feature so I know who wants to speak, and that could be found in your top toolbar. Okay, I see Diana has a question, so you can go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, you guys. That's a great presentation. I will kick things off while other people think about their questions, but I just wanted to ask Michelle, so in terms of the patterns you're seeing, you see this moisture CMI sensitivity with white spruce. The far plots are generally growing better than the close plots, which you kind of might expect given that white spruce don't really want their feet wet. But then you do see that in these really drought years that you have suppressed growth, and in more recent years more sensitivity. So do you think, is there some kind of flip happening, and can you see that maybe something a little more subtle than what you've looked at so far? How can you kind of see where you have this flip from upland sites are doing better to maybe peatland adjacent sites are do better? Have you seen anecdotally any of that, and how would you look at it?
Well, I think so, considering that the trees in those farther away from the peatlands, they have these massive increases in growth, or proportionally greater increases of growth, and then these proportionally greater decreases. My initial thought is that there's the potential for these trees, we haven't seen a really dramatic flipperoo in how they're responding, but it could be a matter of time before these trees are just so stressed with these increases and decreases in growth that there is more of a switching point where their growth rates change dramatically. But I don't think I've seen that yet in the data, but that will be too.
It's too bad you didn't have data from last year, right? Because the big drought, and so because it seems like maybe it's hard to use the past to predict the future when we haven't seen enough of these really extreme events yet to know what happens. But now we're starting to see them, so it'll be neat if you can kind of use some of those specific events to start making more emphasis.
Yeah, and 10 years from now, it'll be really neat to see how that heat dome affected those trees.
I do see one question in the chat from Gordon Whitmore. I can read that out loud for everyone. If you were asked to identify where refugia should be considered in a landscape having natural disturbance cycles of 45 to 75 years, do you feel confident that you could identify them for consideration in forest management plans?
Well, I mean, I think if the results of what we come up with are, the refugia we suggest would be, proximity to peatlands, that may buy these areas a little bit extra time, just being next to the peatlands that may be buffered themselves from fire. Yeah, no, that's right. Like the boreal burns pretty frequently, but just, increasing the area that has the potential to stick around, I think would still be worth something.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions at this time, I want to thank our two speakers very much for giving us your lunch hour to share this wonderful research with us. Best of luck when you finalize your results. And perhaps we can see you guys back when you do have a little bit more to share. And thank you very much for everyone who joined us today for taking your lunch hour as well to help us discuss and explore some of these topics. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.